All right, this is the third part of the lecture on urbanization. This one shouldn't take too long, I don't think. We finished talking about the middle class. Now we're going to talk about the wealthy. These are the people that live on the outskirts of town that don't have to do the interaction with the factories and the dirtiness. This is where the term Gilded Age comes from. This handful of people that live this incredibly extravagant lifestyle that make the United States look like everyone's rich, when in reality, that's not the case at all. These are elite families. Now, some of these, the one thing about American society is it didn't necessarily have to be that you had an important family name. In other words, you could work your way up largely with that. Will you close the door? Sorry. You could work your way up into that elite family status. But just because you worked your way up did not mean that you had to have this pedigree. But once you got there, you had a great deal of wealth that separated you from everyone else. So this is where the term Gilded Age comes from. These people copy the European styles. If you're a big fan of Downton Abbey, this is kind of where Cora comes from. She would have been one of those elites that her family had gained a lot of wealth because of the Gilded Age. And a lot of these times, these people would go to Europe and they would marry into nobility that were impoverished. So that was a very common kind of thing that happened. The wealthy often set the trend that they copy from Europe. And then the standards are often copied by the middle class. But the difference was the middle class copied the standards, but they were very motivated to spread morality and sobriety and try to improve the world around them, whereas the wealthy typically were not. They didn't have to engage with those elements, so they weren't as concerned with it. And they knew they were the ones that everybody was copying. This is a picture that shows you your classic well-to-do Gilded Age party. Notice the excess of fabric dragging on the floor, indicating their extreme wealth. And, this is a mixed gathering to a certain extent, although you still had a lot of gender rules that came into play. If you've ever watched the movie Age of Innocence, based on Edith Wharton's novel, that's a really good depiction of this kind of environment. And behind all of this is this idea of rags to riches, that we call them Horatio Alger stories. That if you are a good person, if you're honest, if you work really hard, you will be successful, that there's plenty of opportunity in the United States, and that social problems are the result of individual weakness or individual inaction. And you can see we still are dominated by this mentality even today, that people that aren't making it, so to speak, in the world are because they're not trying. And that's not entirely wrong. But let's understand that we have a lot of forces at work. We've discussed the fact that laissez-faire was not really laissez-faire, and that certainly wealthy individuals were able to influence politics in a way that protected their wealth, whereas the working class and the unions were largely powerless. So while this has a degree of truth and a degree of merit, we also need to understand that sometimes there's forces at work beyond somebody's control. Social Darwinism loved the Horatio Alger stories because it reinforces this idea that, hey, white Anglo-Saxons, especially those born in the United States, just naturally have it more together than everybody else. And it kind of justifies that mentality. And that people that are black or immigrants or women or Native Americans just aren't naturally inclined towards that level of success. And what they fail to examine by not considering the impact of society on limiting one's options, they fail to consider kind of a social responsibility to creating a level of fairness. And this is kind of what happens when you think back to the unions lecture when I talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is kind of what there starts to be an awareness by the 1890s that there is some social inequality that goes beyond just somebody's not making it, right? And so this is kind of part of that irony that the United States deals with, this dichotomy of our personality, that we believe in that hard work and that individualism, even as we recognize sometimes the deck is stacked against a person. And so this is kind of the myth of rags to riches. This shows you a couple of the books. I actually have a couple of these at home. If I think about it, I'll bring them. Other social influences. Victorianism, named after England's Queen Victoria, who became the monarch in like 1830 or 1840. And she's the monarch all the way through the rest of the 19th century. She was very kind of, uptight, very, very family oriented. She set rules about, social behavior, about how long you had to mourn a spouse, or, when girls could start to be courted by men. And these kind of customs and mores become very rigid and fixed to counter the turbulent industrial growth and the changes that industrialization is bringing to society. And so Victorianism is largely about social control. And this is where you begin to have these crusades against moral pollution, breaking down the red light districts. The 1873 Comstock Law, which was meant to attack things that were considered, too sexual of a nature. And there was this strong emphasis on individual morality, especially for women. It was almost as though women were meant to be responsible for the morality of the entire society, that women had to be self-controlled and modest and work hard and all that kind of stuff, and they had to set this example for their families. Men were expected to be moral as well, but shortcomings were more accepted for men than they were for women. And fashion certainly reinforces this, with women being covered, the corsets emphasizing kind of the hourglass shape and all that kind of stuff. And Victorianism said that sex was not appropriate unless it was for procreation. Of course, the thing is, men were known to be sexual creatures, so their sexual appetites were more permitted, I guess you could say. Of course, the great irony is, if a man has a sexual appetite, he needs a partner, right? So this is kind of interesting, that these Victorian rules dominate the middle class society and the upper class society. And yet the working class largely reject this, because the working class know that a lot of this idea that women are more moral than men, or that sex is only good for procreation, the working class have a whole different perspective. So we see that when we're talking about morality, there's a huge disconnect between the two. Then we see that, Then we see, this is a classic picture of, fiddlesticks. All right, there we go. Classic picture of Victorian women and how buttoned up they were and all that kind of stuff. Temperance, the reform movement.